I was born and raised right here on the Central Coast. My family's been ranching here in California for 3 generations on my mother's side. My father's a U.S. Army veteran and a doctor who, when I was a kid, used his medical expertise to invent and develop devices to help treat repetitive stress injuries. My mother went back to college to learn how to run a business. I grew up packing boxes, taking inventory out of our garage, going to different chambers around our community, working different trade shows, building this business from scratch. Today I'm vice president of that business. I've seen regulations that are coming out of Washington, D.C. that make it difficult for businesses like ours to survive, let alone thrive. A few years ago, I worked for a senior member of Congress. I was dealt with a number of different issues from foreign policy to agriculture to small business, commerce, manufacturing, and trade. It was my job to assess and evaluate how these policies affected us, the current circumstances that we were in and where we were heading. It was my job to move those policies through both chambers in the House and the Senate. What I found there was that you hear a lot of empty rhetoric from career politicians, folks that are more focused on their next election than they are the policies that affect the rest of us in the next generation. We see that there is a zero-sum game of winner-take-all between Republicans and Democrats in Washington, D.C., where the biggest losers in the equation is the rest of us and the future of our country. I'm running for Congress to bring a strong voice from the Central Coast to Washington, D.C. to get that institution working again for the American people and the future of this country. I look forward to discussing many of the issues with all of you this evening and answering any questions that you have. And I also am grateful that Mr. Carbajal, you're here to have that conversation as well. Thank you.
The 24th District. Mr. Fareed, we'll start with you.
This is a great question. Well, I was born and raised here on the Central Coast. My background fits this district, from agriculture to small business. The grit, the determination, the drive, the vision, the backbone to do what's right, regardless of party, Republican or Democrat, is necessary in the characteristics of someone to be effective in the governing body in the United States Congress. When I worked back there, I saw the gridlock. I saw that there were so many people who were more focused on their next election and career politicians that would dish out empty rhetoric rather than getting to the substance of policy and the solutions. We need people who are more focused on the rest of us and the American people. My goal throughout this entire campaign is to build a grassroots base from the bottom up, and the reason I'm on this stage here today is because of the effort of so many people from all over the Central Coast getting involved and active in the government they have. That's the accountability structure. That is where we actually can make a difference, is here on the Central Coast with our representation to the United States Congress. We need to reform that institution to get it working again for the American people and the future of this country. I've laid out a plan that can make that institution stronger, that can take on the big challenges that we're facing, from our local drought to our national debt. And I look forward to being able to represent and serve you in the United States Congress because my background fits this district and I have policy solutions that will move us forward in a more positive direction.
Mr. Fareed, thank you. Mr. Carbajal, what qualifies?
And
what do you feel are the most important challenges facing our district, and what steps will you take as a member of Congress to address the issue? Mr. Carbajal?
Thank you very much. Well, I heard a lot of talking points there and political rhetoric, but not actual solutions to problems that we're facing. I meet with people from all different backgrounds around the Central Coast and have been over the course of the last year and a half. We've seen that the impacts of this local drought that is perpetuating itself all over California, it's only going to get worse. We've seen a lack of foresight from past and current politicians and investments in infrastructure, and specifically for water, like desalination. That's something that we need to invest in. We look at countries like Israel, who get over 70% of their water from desalination, so much so that they actually export and sell water to their neighboring countries and actually generate revenue. We need to have a 21st century water policy in the state of California, and investing in desalination has got to be a top priority, including water treatment facilities where we can recycle water, and increasing capacity in reservoirs in the long term so that we can store water during wet years. The steps I would take in the United States Congress is get steered to the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, and specifically the Subcommittee on Water and Environment, so that we can leverage public and private partnerships to make these investments moving forward. And this is something that affects everyone, regardless of your political affinity, regardless of whether you're in agriculture, you're a resident here. Everyone's affected by this, and we need solutions, and we need them now. When you look at the struggling middle class, my opponent has been in a county office in politics for 12 years, and 12 years prior to that, we've seen the largest growth in income inequality in Santa Barbara County during his time, and strangling the middle class because jobs and businesses are moving out of the economy. We need to turn this model around. I have a plan for that, and we'll look forward to discussing that moving forward.
All right, Mr. Fareed, thank you. And you did
respond. You know, my opponent touts his experience running for Congress, playing high school football, as it was demonstrated in one of his commercials, and working 1 year for a disgraced member of Congress who recently resigned under ethical violations. I certainly hope you could do better, Mr. Fareed, because going to Congress, you need to be able to hit the ground first day running, to be able to solve the many issues and challenges our working families, middle-class families.
Mr. Carvajal, thank you.
And with all due respect to Mr. Carvajal, who has served on a
Gentlemen,
nonpartisan
we do
board of
have
5.
about an hour left, so let's just stick to the issues, please.
I would love that.
Let's talk about water. Mr. Fareed, you did talk about the drought and desalination, but we do have a question from the audience, and it does pertain to water. What is your plan to fund your proposed desalination plants, and where in the state will they go? Mr. Fareed?
Well, we're working to get online, one down in Santa Barbara. I know it's been a bureaucratic nightmare to get it up and going. When you look at Diablo that has to shut down by 2025, it has the infrastructure already to be able to be turned into a desalination plant. This is something that we need to pursue moving forward. It will help create more jobs and new jobs for those employees up here in San Luis Obispo that rely heavily on PG&E. There's a number of different infrastructure bills that could be used as vehicles in the federal government to make this happen, but I believe that we need to streamline the process so that we have public and private partnerships on this front, so that we can allow the private sector to come in and invest and improve our infrastructure moving forward in conjunction with different layers of government, from the municipal level up to the state and over to the federal government. This has to happen in conjunction with one another and through coordination at all levels.
Mr. Fareed, thank you. Mr. Carvajal?
Thank you very much. Well,
it's funny that you bring up climate change, because that is the topic of the next question, also from an audience member. Global warming. Do you believe global warming is caused by human activity, and what is your plan to combat it, Mr. Carvajal?
to make sure that we are meeting certain goals, that we are mitigating our greenhouse gas emissions, and that we are doing everything possible to work collaboratively to address this very important issue of climate change. I don't need to tell you that we are all experiencing significant and extraordinary weather patterns, hurricanes, drought, year-round fire seasons, sea level rise. And until we get working on this issue more aggressively and collaboratively, we're not going to be able to address this issue. I'm proud that I convened a tri-county symposium. San Luis Obispo County, Santa Barbara County, and Ventura counties. We brought together community leaders, NGOs, policymakers to discuss this very important issue and to discuss how, on a regional basis, we could come up with a plan to start addressing that issue more effectively regionally. Thank you.
Mr. Carvajal, thank you. Mr. Fareed, do you believe global warming is caused by human activity, and what is your plan to combat it?
Well, there's a number of factors that contribute to climate changing, and this is something I'm very passionate about. When we look, and I've met with a number of people who've worked on innovation to improve energy efficiency, and I think we are the leader here in this country with the technology and the innovation to move towards greater energy efficiency, so we're not consuming as much energy as we were in the past. And I think this is something that we can continue to be at the forefront of and distribute those types of products around the world so that we can decrease energy consumption. Furthermore, moving towards a decarbonized future needs to be at the forefront. That innovation and ingenuity is going to happen through the course of time, and I'm very much a proponent to that. I think that In time, we will gradually wean off of fossil fuels, that the technology will be there, and in time will be readily accessible and affordable to the general public, not just in the United States, but around the world.
And just to clarify, do you believe it is human caused?
I believe that there are multiple different factors that contribute to it. Absolutely, there are.
All right, on to the next question. This one is on oil drilling. This also from the audience. What is your position on offshore oil drilling? Do you have a plan for oil leaks and cleanup? Mr. Fareed?
Well, I find it interesting that my opponent talks about being opposed to offshore oil drilling when he voted in favor of it in 2008. But I'm very practical with this approach. As long as it's well regulated, well managed, there's local oversight in that regard so that we don't have detrimental impacts with any, I think anyone would agree that one drop of oil is one more than is afforded by anybody involved, and it's necessary that we have good oversight to ensure that there is no potential spills moving forward, and I think that needs to happen through local oversight and enforcement.
Mr. Carbajal?
Thank you. I think tonight you're going to see my opponent not answer questions directly. That was a pretty simple question. Are you for offshore oil drilling or fracking or not? And I will tell you, I'm against offshore oil drilling and against fracking. It's really interesting that my opponent continues to try to deceive the public. The vote that he's referring to was to sunset oil development off our coast. I find it appalling that my opponent would make such assertion. I believe that we need to move to a renewable energy economy. And I believe that we need to do everything possible to stop offshore oil drilling and fracking here in our county and on the Central Coast. I am absolutely against it. And again, keep an eye out on my opponent. He's going to continue to go round and round and not answer any of your questions.
Well, I think if you looked at the last debate from Sunday.
Just 1 second, Mr. Fareed. Do you have a plan for oil leaks and cleanup, Mr. Carbajal?
Absolutely. We need to make sure that we have OSPRA, state funding, and federal funding with the United States Coast Guard. Put a supply of equipment and to have the flotilla of boats available should there be future offshore oil leaks or onshore leaks that wind up in our ocean, as we saw with the Plains oil spill. Absolutely, we need to make sure that that exists and that we have regulation that requires oil companies to adhere to create a safe environment, not only for people, but for the environment. My opponent received an inordinate amount of money from Greca Oil Company, one of the biggest polluters that we've had in Santa Barbara County. Not to mention the thousands of dollars that he received from coal oil companies. It's all public record.
I'd like to respond. You voted in favor of new offshore oil drilling with PXP. That's what you voted for in 2008. So, and moreover, you talk about not answering questions. I'm pretty specific with the policies moving forward, Mr. Carbajal. And you also spent hundreds of thousands of dollars, you and your puppet masters in Washington, D.C., and the super PACs, deceiving the public and trying to make this campaign about Donald Trump and the presidential race. My mission, this entire campaign, is bringing local values, Central Coast values, to Washington, D.C., to take the voice of the Central Coast to that body and get that body working again for the American people. So spare us the ridiculous rhetoric, please.
Mr. Fareed, thank you. We're going to move on to jobs and the economy now. This question is from the audience. What plans do you have to create jobs and grow our local economy? Mr. Fareed?
This has to start through the United States Congress. When we look at the amount of excessive spending, both the waste and the fraud that exists within Congress, it comes back to a broken budget system. In order to create growth, we need to reform the regulatory burdens that are imposed upon startup entrepreneurs, upon small businesses so that they can grow, they can create jobs moving forward. We need to reduce spending through government because the taxation that comes in conjunction with that makes it very difficult to continue to grow and to expand for small business people all over the Central Coast. We need to be able to invest in things like we have the hothouse here in San Luis Obispo. We have the GLEAD Entrepreneurial Magnet down in Santa Barbara County. This allows for startup entrepreneurs and innovators to be able to have an opportunity to take that vision, turn it into a reality, and that's something that's critically important moving forward. But this starts through systemic reform in the United States Congress, budget reform that will reduce waste and fraud and ensure that investments are made that actually improve the lives of all Americans, that yield a return for the future of this country. And that comes through a 2-year budget process. So we have one budget for one Congress, and this is something I'm very passionate about doing. This will reduce any kind of special interest or partisan politics that exists, get back to the substance of what is working and what isn't working, help us create economic growth, more jobs in the future, but also begin to address the long-term debt that this country is incurring and strapping on the backs of future generations.
Mr. Fareed, thank you. Mr. Carvajal?
Well, I disagree with some of those points my opponent made. Washington is not going to create our jobs for us. Washington can certainly be a partner, but they're not going to create our jobs for us. Small businesses are the backbone of our economy. We need to do everything possible to make sure that we're providing capital to small businesses so that they could flourish and create more jobs and grow their enterprises. We need to make sure that there's tax relief, and that could come in different forms, to support our small businesses so that they can grow and prosper. We need to make sure that we're addressing a very, very important piece of legislation that brought a lot of good, but is still challenging some of our businesses. The Affordable Care Act has done so good in providing health insurance to so many Americans. Not requiring that insurances do not preclude pre-existing illnesses. But you know, for businesses and many Americans, there's still some challenges that exist with the Affordable Care Act, and we need to do everything possible to continue to bring costs down, not throw out the American Affordable Care Act like Justin Fareed has advocated for. We need to do everything possible that the federal government can do to ensure that they're investing and incentivize new technology, new renewable energy sectors, employment sectors, so that we could create more jobs. We need to make sure that we're working together in a bipartisan way, both Republicans and Democrats, to bring about an infrastructure bill that shores up our infrastructure, our roads, our parks, so that we can create more jobs. We need to make sure that we are helping the San Luis Obispo County in particular to deal with the impacts that the closure of Diablo Canyon is going to have, to make sure that we're retraining employees, that we are making sure that the Federal Workforce Investment Opportunity Program brings down and bears down the resources to help in that regard.
Mr. Carvajal, thank you. We do want to take a moment to address our viewers at home. For those of you just joining us, you are watching now. Mr. Carvajal, where do you stand on women's reproductive rights?
I am 100% pro-choice. I believe that we need to protect. I am 100% pro-choice.
Mr. Carvajal, thank you. Mr. Fareed?
Well, this is a deeply personal decision that needs to be made between a woman, her doctor, a clergyman, her family, whomever it may be. I think politicians and the federal government need to stay out of this.
I think voters, though, might want to know where you stand on it if it does come to the point where you are having to make a vote on it.
Well, my point is I am staying out of it. It's not an issue that I believe the federal government needs to be dealing with.
All right.
It is the law of the land, and that's the way it should be.
Okay. Another social issue, this one from the audience. What is your position on marriage equality, Mr. Fareed?
I believe that everybody should be treated equally under the law.
Mr. Carvajal?
I am for marriage equality. I believe that love is love, and everybody should be able to love and marry who they love. I think the Supreme Court decision that passed recently was a great landmark decision for our country. One that acknowledged the civil rights of our LGBTQ community. And I was very proud to be an American on the day that that decision was reached by our United States Supreme Court. Unequivocally, I am for marriage equality.
This one goes to gun control laws, and Mr. Carbajal, we'll start with you. This is from Facebook. Do you support additional gun control laws? And how would you keep guns from people who shouldn't have them while not putting a burden on law-abiding citizens?
Well, first and foremost, I want to say that I support the Second Amendment. But within the Second Amendment, there is plenty of room to make sure we have sensible gun laws here in our country. We've seen too much gun violence throughout our country, whether it's individuals committing suicide or individuals killing and murdering other individuals. That's something that we need to do everything possible to bring down. In states where sensible gun laws have been passed, gun violence has gone down. I believe we need to enact sensible gun laws that do that provide universal background checks for anybody who wants to buy a gun, that we ban high-capacity ammunition magazines, that we ban assault rifles from our streets. I've been in the Marine Corps. I know the damage those weapons can do. And you know, there's many people who are going under certain mental challenges that shouldn't have access to weapons as well. I have a sister that committed suicide. I know firsthand what can happen when you have somebody who isn't in the right mental state have a gun. And it's quite a shame that Congress has not been able to move forward sensible gun laws. Not even a law that precludes those that are on the no-fly list from having access to guns. You could be on the no-fly list and still purchase a gun. It's that easy. That's shameful. We need to make sure we bring about sensible gun laws in the United States. And I will be an advocate day one in Congress.
Mr. Fareed, I will repeat the question. This
Thank
comes
you.
from Facebook. Do you support additional gun control laws? And how would you keep guns from people who should not have them while not putting a burden on law-abiding citizens?
Well, thank you for asking the question again, because I don't think I heard an answer to either one of those two questions. And it's also a surprise to me that you're a supporter of the Second Amendment based on the fact that the only two commercials that you've run have been attacking the Second Amendment or attacking me, comparing me to a presidential nominee. But I am a supporter of the Second Amendment. I think when you're talking about, and the question was, how do you prevent people who get these guns illegally with the intent to use them illegally, how do you not infringe upon somebody who is a law-abiding citizen and their rights? This is something that's very important, is looking at the actual source of the problem. Creating more gun laws in a state like California does not do anything for those who are abiding by the law, and it's necessary that we address the source of the problem. And again, that is a lack of follow-through at all levels of mental health in this country, and the resources that are afforded to those different programs. It's necessary that we do that. I heard a statistic last night that 33,000 people have gun violence or attacks in this country, where roughly 2/3 of them are suicide. This is something that we have to take very seriously in our follow-through. And secondly, is we need to ensure that our law enforcement has the necessary resources to be able to ensure that those that have a criminal record or past could actually have the follow-through to enforce the laws that are already on the books. Those two components need a legitimate follow-through, and they haven't for many years.
You mentioned my name, can I respond?
Please.
You know, if the shoe fits, then I think Mr. Fareed needs to wear it. You know, Mr. Fareed has stood shoulder to shoulder with Donald Trump when he degraded women time and time again, when he made misogynistic comments, racist comments about minorities.
This is ridiculous.
If I could finish.
That's absolutely ridiculous.
Let's stick to the issues,
You should
please.
be ashamed
Let's
of
stick to the
yourself for
issues.
the deceptive ads.
When he
that you put
degraded
out.
Gold Star veteran families.
Of course, it's politically
Gentlemen,
expedient
please.
to deflect
We
from the
only
issues
have
that
about
are
20 minutes left, and we do
relevant
want to
here
make
on
sure
the
that we're
Central
getting to the
Coast.
touch
Am
on
I
the
going to be
folks
allowed
have
to
asked.
finish, Karina?
We're going to move on to the issues.
Okay,
Thank you. Let's talk about health care now. This comes from the audience. While millions of Americans now have health insurance through the Affordable Care Act, premiums are going up. How would you fix this problem, Mr. Carbajal?
There's this gamemanship of no, we gotta get rid of it. How about making it better? How about giving us a proposal that will improve the lives, the healthcare delivery programs in healthcare of all Americans?
Mr. Carbajal, thank you.
Thank
Mr.
you.
Farid, I'll repeat the question and give you a chance to respond there. While millions of Americans now have health insurance through the Affordable Care Act, premiums are going up. How would you fix the problem?
Well, first, I find it interesting that my opponent tries to tie me in. You know, unlike you, I haven't spent my entire professional career as a politician. Secondly, what we saw with the passage of the Affordable Care Act, we have to understand where this failed us fundamentally, and this was in Congress. It was passed as a military housing bill in the United States House, into the Senate, gutted and turned into the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act, and was passed with the supermajority in the Senate. Mr. Kennedy died, they lost the supermajority in the Senate, and was essentially passed in rough draft form in the United States House without a single hearing or markup done, without improving the actual policy the first time through. This was a clear example of politics working at its finest and politicians getting away from good substantive policy. We should have fixed this from the first time through, and it should have had the necessary due diligence. Not one Republican voted for it in the House of Representatives. 34 Democrats voted against it. And now we're seeing bureaucratic fixes to it with mandates and taxes that are affecting all of us. Premiums are going up. Deductibles are skyrocketing. People are losing coverage. There are some benefits to it. People with pre-existing conditions now have insurance. This is something that was a positive from the Affordable Care Act, but it does need to be brought back before Congress to be reformed and improved. We need to look at things like real tort reform at the state level in the United States Congress, because with frivolous lawsuits, they drive up a cost for healthcare all the way across the board. So real tort reform is something that's necessary because it causes defensive medicine, which means that people are overdiagnosed, that they're pre-treated, and they're forced to do a number of different things that aren't necessary to actually treat the problem moving forward. We need to be able to create more competition across state lines so that people have the ability to purchase insurance, to create more options and more affordable types of coverages moving forward. We need to be able to increase portability so people have the ability to take it from job to job moving forward. These are just some of the steps that need to be taken in the United States Congress and in a bipartisan way moving forward to improve our healthcare system and to reduce costs and ensure that people have access to affordable healthcare moving forward.
Mr. Farid, thank you. The next topic is immigration, and it comes from an audience member. Do you support immigration reform, and which programs do you support? Mr. Farid?
Absolutely. One of the fundamental policies that I'm going to work to push in the United States Congress is to go to a single subject rule. We've seen the conversation and the political rhetoric between both parties talk about comprehensive immigration reform. That's a talking point, it's not an actual solution. I believe that the only way to reduce the partisan banter, the partisan rhetoric, and the special interests is to be able to reduce the size of legislation so it's only relative to that one topic, so that we could actually get back to bringing solutions to the table. Immigration reform is a great example of that. This is a very complex and very widespread issue that affects so many people around our country. We need to make sure that we have strengthened borders. We need to ensure that we have an entry-exit visa process so that we understand and know who's coming into our country and for how long. We need to be able to have functional, well-monitored, and robust guest worker programs so that folks have the ability, farmers and ranchers have the ability to ensure that they have labor so that we could reduce costs on the grocery counter. There are many different steps that we could take to improve this so that we have a lasting, legal, and functional immigration process, which we don't, because currently it's not merit-based. You have essentially a lottery system in Congress. It should be able to improve the economy and be merit-based, and we need to address that on a step-by-step basis.
Mr. Farid, how would you address the millions who are here illegally?
Well, first we need to address the different proposals that I just said, because talking about amnesty or deportation are talking points and symptoms. We have to have a functional legal immigration process, but of course, having people pay back taxes or be penalized for overstaying their visa is something that's a necessary step, and then potentially moving towards legal status in this country could be there with that merit-based system. But we also have to take into consideration those who potentially are breaking the law, who are potentially dangerous. We need to be able to deport them and have a strong border so that they can't just come back the very next day.
Mr. Carbajal, do you support immigration reform, and which programs do you support?
Absolutely. Let me start by saying that I've never worked in Washington. And my understanding of addressing immigration reform is addressing a system that's broken. You know, when my family and I immigrated to this country, the system worked. You applied, you went through a process, you went through physical, you went through a background check. It worked. And I'm living proof that it worked. Our immigration system has been broken for a number of years. What we need to do is make sure that we pass legislation to bring about reform, like the United States Senate did with S-15. That was a proposal that was reached in a bipartisan fashion. Both Republicans and Democrats in the Senate rolled up their sleeves and found common ground in a program that identified the following components: a pathway to citizenship, making sure everybody goes through a background check. Everybody who wants to pursue that opportunity goes through a background check. That everybody has to pay their taxes. And of course, that we secure our borders. But that would allow over 11 million people who are contributing to this economy in fear to come out of the shadows and to continue to contribute, whether it's in our agriculture fields or other employment sectors where many of the labor comes from, or is needed, should I say. That's what we can do to bring about comprehensive immigration reform, to make sure that folks have a pathway to citizenship.
All right, the next question is on terrorism. Mr. Carbajal, what policies and programs will you support to combat terrorism threats, both foreign and domestic? And this question comes from our Facebook page.
Thank you so much. Well, you know, I served in the United States Marine Corps, and I know firsthand what it's like to be in the front lines to protect our country, to know what it's like to be mobilized for a war. I was sent to North Carolina and sent back home. The war ended before we could go out to the theater. I know what that feels like for my family who had to endure that. I know what that feels like as a service member who's mobilized for that threat. ISIS is a very serious threat, and other terrorist groups in the world. And we need to do everything possible to work with our allies, to work with Middle Eastern countries, to make sure that we are being bold and smart, that we are surgical and strategic in our airstrikes, that we're doing everything possible to isolate and destroy ISIS. And here in our country, we know terrorism has reached our land. We need to do everything possible to build on our technology, work with the Muslim community to make sure that we root out radical cells, and to do everything possible to secure Americans here and abroad. But you know what we shouldn't do is do what my opponent's preferred choice for president has been doing, Donald Trump. He's been demonizing certain religions. He's been demonizing Muslims, not to mention other groups that I mentioned earlier, women, Gold Star families, veterans. He has provided the biggest recruitment tool for these fanatical terrorists. That's the one thing that we shouldn't be doing. Thank you very much.
Can you ask the question one more time?
Absolutely. What policies and programs will you support to combat terrorism threats, both foreign and domestic?
Sure, and thank you for the question. This is really important. I just want to point out my opponent talked about not giving an answer earlier in this debate. I think you just saw living proof of that right there. My opponent supported things like the Iran nuclear deal that opened up billions of dollars, $150 billion to Iran, that supported $400 million in ransom for four American hostages that they were holding. You look at what Iran is doing, and funding. They're the #1 state sponsor of terrorism in both Lebanon and Iraq and Yemen. We have serious problems on our hand. I served, when I was back in Washington, D.C., I did foreign policy. I helped run the U.S.-Turkish Relations Caucus. I led a delegation to Turkey, was on the Syrian border. We need to improve our relations with our allies in that region. This notion that this administration has had from leading from behind has been a terrible policy that has really left our allies in the wind. We need to strengthen our relationships with our NATO partners moving forward. We have to come up with a concerted approach that will provide certainty moving forward. With regard to domestic terrorism, we need to improve our cybersecurity. We have to be prepared in the face of 21st century warfare. A lot of what ISIS has been doing is recruiting with online and leveraging the digital space. What we're seeing happening is there's been very little or limited training with local law enforcement. We're fortunate we have a cybersecurity center here at Cal Poly. It's the only one this side of the Mississippi. The only other one is in Hoover, Alabama. We need to be able to ensure that local law enforcement has that type of training as well. So those are some policies, both foreign and domestic.
All right, we are running out of time, so we have time for just one more question, and this
Karina,
will just be
he
1
brought up
minute
my
response.
name regarding
We're running out of time here. And this is in an effort to end things on a positive note here and to steal a line from one of the presidential debates. Can you each state something that you admire about your opponent? 1 minute response. Mr. Carbajal.
Thank you. You know, I admire my opponent's confidence and willingness to run for Congress, not just once, but twice. At his age, I'm not sure that I would have been doing that. At his age, I was serving in the United States Marine Corps. I had a young family. But I do admire that he has a desire to serve our country and public service running for Congress.
Mr. Fareed?
Sounded like a whole lot of nonsense to me. The answer is no, I can't.
Okay. And that will conclude the question and responses segment right now of the forum. We do want to give each candidate a minute to one last pitch to the audience and to the viewers at home. 1 minute closing statement, and since Mr. Fareed gave the opening statement to voters here in the audience and at home with 1 minute closing statement.
Well, I'm grateful for the opportunity to be here this evening to have this conversation, be able to debate the issues. I decided to run for Congress because I saw a broken institution that wasn't working for you and I, for the Central Coast and the future of this country. I'm determined, I'm focused, and I'm, more than anything, working to be able to bring that strong voice, not because of a Republican or a Democrat, but because I'm an American. There is a strong contrast in this race. I built my campaign from the bottom up and from the support of so many throughout the Central Coast, Republican, Democrats, independents, small businessmen and women, fishermen, farmers, teachers, students, entrepreneurs of all sorts, to build this campaign against a machine politician. He was endorsed and supported by Lois Capps, Nancy Pelosi, every insider in Washington, D.C. before a single poll was made, before a single vote was casted by anybody here on the Central Coast. The #1 problem that we have is not between Republicans and Democrats. It's people who are career politicians who put their own interests ahead of ours. I'm here to break that mold and to represent you in Washington, D.C. Thank you.
Gentlemen, thank you both for your time here tonight. We certainly appreciate it. To the audience and to the viewers at home, I'm sure they appreciated your thoughtful answers as well. We do want to thank everybody, gentlemen, the viewers at home, and the audience for those thoughtful questions as well. On behalf of Cal Poly, the League of Women Voters, and KSBY, we hope that you found this forum informational and helpful as you get ready to cast your vote on November 8th. Remember, we will be continuing this forum for another half hour on KSBY.com. For those of you joining us there, we will see you online. Otherwise, I'm Karina Corral with KSBY News. Thank you and good night.
Excellent job.
Economy. How will you support the technology industry here on the Central Coast? Mr. Carvajal?
Thank you.